Will the government commit to stripping citizenship from dual nationals implicated and deport them as well? Race or religion must protect nobody, including family members who were aware of the crimes and therefore complicit. Wives, sisters, mothers, cousins, if they knew and said nothing. These individuals are just as guilty as the rapists themselves.
You're being overly descriptive and disrespectful to the victims. These words, uttered by a parliamentary leader, weren't aimed at a criminal, but at an MP trying to expose the truth about grooming gangs. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video.
Madam Deputy Speaker, given that the opposition amendment has been accepted, I'm not going to stand here and outline my disgust at what has happened with regard to the historic grooming scandal. The British people want answers, so I'm going to ask questions of the Labour Party and several of them. Will the government commit to urgently deporting all guilty foreign nationals involved?
A fiery exchange that set social media ablaze. Tory MP Darren Millar faced fierce opposition for simply stating facts. This clash between truth-telling and political correctness has left many wondering, what are they trying to hide? In the hallowed halls of the Welsh Parliament, a storm was brewing. Conservative MP Darren Millar stood ready to address a topic that's been simmering beneath the surface of polite society: grooming gangs. As Millar began to speak, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted palpably. His words, raw and unfiltered, cut through the usual political platitudes like a knife through butter.
Now we have businesses saying they will raise prices to cover his jobs tax. We have an energy policy that will drive up bills, and all the while we are spending more day to day on debt interest. The Retail Consortium says 2/3 of businesses will have to raise prices to cope with his tax hike. His Chancellor ignored all the warnings and ploughed ahead with an unprecedented borrowing spree, leaving all of us more vulnerable. The Prime Minister refused to repeat his Chancellor's promise that she wouldn't come back for more. Will he now rule out any new tax rises this year?
Yeah. But it wasn't long before the parliamentary machinery kicked into gear. As Millar delved into the harrowing experiences of victims, he was met with an unexpected obstacle. The parliamentary leader, seemingly uncomfortable with the stark realities being presented, intervened. I think verging on not being totally respectful of the victim at this point came the admonishment, a thinly veiled attempt to muzzle Millar's message. The accusations leveled at Millar were as surprising as they were contradictory. Overly descriptive and disrespectful. Two charges that seem at odds with each other. How can one be too descriptive when giving voice to victims who have long been silenced? It's a question that hangs in the air, unanswered and troubling.
Hangs by a thread.
But we have an ironclad commitment to our fiscal rules. We can't just tax our way out of the problems that they left us, which is why we put in place tough. Mr. Speaker, we took the right and difficult decisions at the budget. Decisions that they did not have the courage to take, which left us in the mess in the first place. When it comes to tax, she knows very well the limits of what I can say from this dispatch box. They were howling at the spending decisions. They wouldn't take them, and we'll stick to those spending decisions, and our focus is absolutely on growth. But their record, they flatlined the economy.
This clash between Millar and the parliamentary establishment speaks to a broader issue plaguing our political discourse. On one side, we have those who believe that uncomfortable truths must be confronted head-on, no matter how unpalatable. On the other, we find a growing contingent who seem to prioritize political correctness over addressing urgent societal issues. Millar's persistence in the face of mounting pressure is commendable. Despite calls to tone down his language, he stood firm, refusing to sugarcoat the harsh realities of grooming gang activities. It's a stance that raises an important question. Why are some politicians so reluctant to confront these truths? The answer, it seems, lies in the complex web of political maneuvering and fear. Fear of inflaming discrimination, fear of inciting backlash, fear of being labeled insensitive. But at what cost does this fear come? When does sensitivity cross the line from being respectful to becoming a shield for inaction? This incident in the Welsh Parliament is not isolated. It's part of a troubling pattern where MPs discussing sensitive issues, particularly those involving race and crime, find themselves silenced or pressured to soften their language. The rules and protocols designed to maintain decorum during discussions are increasingly being weaponized to stifle debate on serious societal issues that demand urgent attention. The silencing of MPs isn't just a recent phenomenon, it's the tip of a very dark iceberg that stretches back years, revealing a disturbing pattern of inaction on grooming gangs. While politicians argue over language and decorum, a damning report gathers dust, its findings largely ignored since 2022. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse was supposed to be a watershed moment, a chance for the government to finally address the horrors faced by countless children across the UK. Instead, it's become yet another missed opportunity in a long line of failures. Let's be clear, this isn't just about bureaucratic inefficiency. We're talking about a systemic failure to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. The inquiry's findings were nothing short of alarming, highlighting a significant lack of action by authorities despite clear evidence of widespread abuse. Yet, here we are more than a year later, and what's changed? Critics argue that the government has largely turned a blind eye, with no substantial policy changes implemented to address the issues raised. The scale of this problem is staggering. The inquiry reported that grooming gang incidents have been identified in as many as 50 areas across the country. That's not a few isolated cases, it's an epidemic. So how has the government responded? With a mere 5 pilot schemes for local inquiries. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. This piecemeal approach has been rightly criticized for undermining efforts to address the true scale of the issue. A comprehensive national inquiry is what's needed, but apparently that's too much to ask. But let's not forget the human cost behind these statistics. Victims and their families have been left feeling abandoned and betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Their experiences have been overlooked. Their trauma is pushed aside in favor of political expediency. It's a slap in the face to every child who has suffered at the hands of these predators. Even the structure of these inquiries is fundamentally flawed. Without statutory footing, they lack the teeth to compel witnesses and gather comprehensive evidence. It's as if the government is going through the motions without any real commitment to meaningful change. This half-hearted approach has been rightly criticized as woefully inadequate. As the debate on grooming gangs intensifies, Parliament faces a pivotal moment. The upcoming discussions, set to focus on the government's handling of these cases, could be a turning point, with Tory leader Kemi Badenoch challenging Keir Starmer to launch a public probe into the sexual abuse of young girls. The pressure is mounting, but will this lead to real action, or just more political posturing? The call for a national inquiry, tabled as part of the Children's Wellbeing Bill, represents a glimmer of hope. Yet we've seen promising initiatives fizzle out before. Remember the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse? It was supposed to be a game changer, but ended up gathering dust. Will this time be different, or are we doomed to repeat the cycle of grand promises and meager results? The stark reality is that our society faces a choice: confront the uncomfortable truths about grooming gangs head on, or continue to fail our most vulnerable. The victims' voices have been silenced for too long, drowned out by a cacophony of political correctness and institutional cowardice. It's time to ask ourselves, are we really ready to prioritize the protection of children over the comfort of politicians?